Mother wolf abandons her cubs, but the heartbreaking reason leaves everyone in tears. The Montana winter was beginning to loosen its grip as John Anderson stepped onto his cabin's wooden porch, coffee mug in hand. At 68, his hair had long since turned silver, but his blue eyes remained sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, eyes that had seen thousands of animals through illness and injury during his 40 years as a veterinarian. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-patched clearing where his modest cabin stood. Located just outside of Whitefish, Montana, the property bordered national forest land, far enough from town to offer solitude but close enough for necessary supplies. Another day, old-timer, he muttered to himself, a habit he'd developed in the 3 years since Claire's passing. His wife of 40 years would have teased him about talking to himself, but these days, his own voice and the sounds of nature were often his only companions. Inside, the cabin reflected both his professional past and current lifestyle. One wall housed veterinary reference books and medical supplies. He still helped local ranchers with their livestock emergencies. The other walls displayed Claire's nature photographs, many featuring the local wildlife she had loved to document. John followed his morning routine, checking his weather-worn truck to ensure it would start if needed. The calendar on his kitchen wall marked another Tuesday, which meant a supply run into town. His daughter Sarah, who lived in Seattle, insisted he keep to a regular schedule so she could track his movements. She worried about him living alone in the wilderness, especially after that fall he took last winter. "I'm fine out here," he told her during their weekly Sunday call. "The quiet helps me think." What he didn't tell her was how the silence sometimes pressed in too closely, especially during the long winter nights. Claire had always filled their home with music and conversation. Now the only sounds were the wind through the pines and occasional wolf howls in the distance. As he prepared for his walk, a daily ritual that kept him active, John packed his usual supplies. A basic first aid kit, water, some trail mix, and his old binoculars. Claire had given him those binoculars on their 30th anniversary, knowing his love for observing wildlife. "You never know what you might find out there," she used to say, and she'd been right. Over the years, he'd helped injured deer, treated sick cattle for neighboring ranches, and even once rehabilitated a young eagle with a broken wing. The trail he followed wound through dense pine forest before opening into a series of small meadows. Early spring flowers were just beginning to peek through the melting snow, glacier lilies, and spring beauties that Claire would have photographed. He paused to watch a group of elk in the distance, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. Local ranchers respected John's experience with animals, and he'd maintained his veterinary license even after retirement. Just last week, he'd helped the Hendersons with a difficult calving, and the week before that, he'd treated the Matthews horse for colic. These occasional calls gave him purpose, a reason to keep his skills sharp. The forest held different energy today. John noticed fewer bird calls than usual, and the recent tracks in the patchy snow told stories of nighttime drama, deer trails crossed by predator prints, including the distinctive paw marks of wolves. He'd always respected wolves, understanding their vital role in the ecosystem. Unlike some locals who saw them as threats, John appreciated their intelligence and strong family bonds. Claire had photographed them from a distance, capturing their grace and power, their fierce devotion to their pack. As he rounded a bend in the trail, movement in the distance caught his eye. Through his binoculars, he spotted a wolf moving with unusual difficulty through the trees. Even from this distance, his trained eye could see something was wrong with the animal's gait. "Poor girl," he murmured, noting the wolf's distended teats that marked her as a nursing mother. Years of veterinary experience told him she was in distress, though he couldn't determine the cause from this distance. Professional instinct made him want to help, but experience had taught him the delicate balance between intervention and letting nature take its course. Still, he marked the location in his mind, planning to return tomorrow to check on her. As he turned toward home, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, John couldn't shake the image of the struggling wolf. Something about her reminded him of his last cases before retirement. The way animals would look at him with trust, somehow knowing he was there to help. Back at the cabin, he made a simple dinner and noted his observations in the journal Claire had given him years ago. Observed female wolf, approximately 3 to 4 years old, showing signs of distress, he wrote. Location: North Meadow, near the lightning-struck pine. The next morning dawned colder than usual for early spring. John woke before sunrise, his mind still on the wolf he'd spotted yesterday. After 40 years of veterinary practice, he'd learned to trust his instincts when it came to animals in distress. He packed his backpack more thoroughly this time: extra medical supplies, a powerful flashlight, and his old veterinary field guide. Though he knew direct intervention with wild wolves was dangerous and usually illegal, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The morning fog clung to the ground as he made his way back to the North Meadow. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, just a light dusting that made tracking easier. It didn't take long to find fresh wolf prints, deeper on one side, confirming his suspicion about the animal's irregular gait. "You're hurting bad, aren't you, girl?" he muttered, following the tracks with growing concern. The trail showed signs of the wolf frequently stopping to rest, unusual behavior for such a resilient animal. Through his binoculars, he finally spotted her. The wolf had made a temporary den beneath a fallen log, partially hidden by thick undergrowth. What caught his attention immediately was the presence of 3 small cubs, probably no more than 3 weeks old. They were huddled against their mother, who was lying on her side, breathing heavily. John's experienced I could see the signs now. The wolf's flanks were sunken, her coat dull and patchy. More concerning was the way she held her head, tilted slightly to one side. Years of treating farm dogs came rushing back to him. He'd seen these symptoms before. "Canine distemper," he whispered to himself. The viral disease was almost always fatal in wild animals, causing neurological symptoms before eventually leading to death. The mother wolf must have contracted it before giving birth to her cubs. For the next few hours, John observed from a safe distance. The wolf's maternal instincts remained strong despite her illness. She continued to nurse her cubs and attempt to care for them, though her movements were increasingly unsteady. Each time she tried to stand, her legs would tremble, and sometimes she would fall. The cubs, too young to understand their mother's condition, continued to nurse and play around her. Their health appeared good. They were plump and active, protected so far by their mother's antibodies in her milk. But John knew that wouldn't last long. As the day progressed, he watched the mother wolf make several attempted hunting forays, each one shorter and less successful than the last. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Without food and proper care for her cubs, they wouldn't survive long after she was gone. Late in the afternoon, something remarkable happened. The wolf raised her head, looking directly at where John sat concealed behind a fallen log. Her eyes, though clouded with illness, held an intelligence that struck him to his core. She knew he was there, had known, perhaps, all along. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" he whispered, meeting her gaze through his binoculars. The wolf continued to watch him, her expression holding what seemed like a mixture of wariness and something else. Assessment? Hope? John had seen that look before, in the eyes of injured animals brought to his clinic. The desperate trust of a creature who somehow sensed help was near. But this was different. The wolf wasn't looking for help for herself. Her cubs were what mattered now. As darkness approached, John reluctantly headed back to his cabin. That night, he pored over his old veterinary journals and made several calls to former colleagues. Every source confirmed what he already knew: canine distemper was fatal, and the mother wolf had days at most. He barely slept that night, his mind working through scenarios. Direct intervention with wild wolves was dangerous and technically illegal without proper authorization. Yet watching them all die wasn't an option he could live with. In the early hours of the morning, John sat at his kitchen table, Claire's photograph watching him from the wall. "What would you do, honey?" he asked the empty room. Claire had always had a way of seeing through complex problems to find simple, compassionate solutions. The answer came to him just before dawn. He couldn't save the mother wolf. Nature would take its course there. But maybe, just maybe, she would give him a chance to save her cubs. First, though, she would have to trust him enough to allow it. As he packed his bag for another day of observation, John included some additional items: puppy formula, feeding bottles, and basic medical supplies. He didn't know if he'd get the chance to use them, but something told him to be prepared. Sometimes, Claire used to say, animals know more than we give them credit for. Looking at her photograph one last time before heading out, John whispered, "I hope you're right, love, I hope you're right." The third day dawned with a biting chill. John's bones ached as he made his way back to the observation point, his breath forming small clouds in the early morning air. Something felt different today, an urgency in the atmosphere that he couldn't quite explain. He found the wolf's den empty. For a moment, panic gripped him until he spotted fresh tracks leading toward the old logging road that served as his daily walking path. The tracks told a heartbreaking story: frequent stops, uncertain steps, the mother wolf clearly struggling to move forward. Following at a distance, John noticed she was carrying one of her cubs. Despite her weakened state, her movements showed purpose. She would walk a few yards, place the cub down, rest, then return for another. One by one, she was relocating her babies. "What are you up to, girl?" John murmured, keeping his distance but maintaining visual contact through his binoculars. The wolf's condition had deteriorated significantly overnight. Her movements were more erratic, the head tilt more pronounced. Yet there was a determined intelligence in her eyes that commanded respect. As he watched, she gathered all 3 cubs together on a patch of soft grass beside the logging road. It was a spot John passed every day on his morning walks. He realized she must have observed his routine over the past few days, perhaps longer. The mother wolf positioned her cubs carefully, making sure they were visible from the path but protected from the wind by a fallen log. Then she did something that made John's heart clench. She licked each cub thoroughly, as if memorizing their scent, before backing away into the underbrush. Through his binoculars, John could see her watching from her hidden position, her eyes never leaving her cubs. She had chosen this moment, this location, with careful deliberation. The cubs, still too young to wander far, huddled together, occasionally whimpering for their mother. "You're giving them up," John whispered, understanding dawning in his heart. "You're making sure I find them." The wolf's eyes met his across the distance, and in that moment, John felt the weight of her trust. She had recognized him as someone who could help, had perhaps sensed his decades of experience caring for animals. More importantly, she had observed his daily patterns and chosen this spot knowing he would pass by. The cubs, beginning to get hungry and cold, started crying more insistently. John knew he had to act carefully now. Any sudden movements might frighten the mother wolf into taking them back, dooming them to a slow death as her condition worsened. Slowly, deliberately, he began walking along his usual path, pretending he hadn't seen the cubs yet. He kept his movements casual, natural, just another morning walk. As he approached the spot where the cubs lay, he allowed himself to discover them, stopping with a show of surprise. The cubs, hearing his footsteps, huddled closer together. They were beautiful, healthy despite their circumstances. Their eyes recently opened to the world, 2 gray like their mother, one with a distinctive white patch on its chest. John knelt slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. He could feel the mother wolf's gaze on him, watching, judging. This was the moment of truth. "Hello, little ones," he said softly, reaching out with experienced hands to check their condition. The cubs, too young to fear humans, responded to his gentle touch with curious sniffs and tiny whimpers. From her hiding place, the mother wolf watched. She made no move to interfere, though John could see her twitching with maternal instinct. Her trust in this moment was perhaps the most difficult and courageous act of her life. As John carefully gathered the cubs into his jacket, creating a warm, secure carrier, he spoke quietly, his words meant for the watching mother. "I promise you, I'll take care of them. They'll be safe with me." The wolf stood shakily, took one last long look at her cubs, then turned and disappeared into the forest. John knew she was going to find a quiet place for her final hours, having ensured her legacy would live on. Fighting back tears, John cradled the cubs carefully and began the walk back to his cabin. "Your mama chose well, little ones," he murmured. "She loved you enough to let you go." Back at his cabin, John's veteran skills kicked into high gear. He quickly transformed his living room into a makeshift nursery, using an old wooden box lined with soft blankets as a temporary den. His hands, though weathered with age, moved with practiced precision as he prepared the puppy formula. "All right, little ones," he murmured, testing the temperature of the formula on his wrist, a gesture that brought back memories of helping countless newborn animals over his long career. "Let's get some food in you." The cubs were hungry but initially confused by the bottle. John's patience paid off as the first cub, the one with the white chest patch, finally latched on. The others followed suit, learning from their sibling. Their eager nursing brought a smile to his face, though his heart remained heavy thinking of their mother. "You've got your mama's spirit," he told them as they fed. "Strong and determined, just like her." After feeding, John performed a thorough examination of each cub. They were approximately 3 weeks old, healthy despite their ordeal. Their eyes were open, bright and curious, taking in their new surroundings. He noted with relief that they showed no signs of their mother's illness. As he worked, John's mind raced through the legal implications of his situation. Keeping wild wolves without proper authorization was illegal, but he knew the local wildlife authorities well from his veterinary days. He reached for his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Mark, this is John Anderson. We've got a situation I need your help with." Mark Reynolds, the regional wildlife officer and an old friend, listened intently as John explained the morning's events. "You did the right thing, John," Mark assured him. "I'll be out there in a couple of hours with the paperwork. Given your background and the circumstances, we should be able to arrange a temporary care permit." While waiting for Mark, John began documenting everything: the cubs' weights, feeding times, and behaviors. His veterinary training had taught him the importance of detailed records. He also took photos, knowing they'd be needed for the permit application. The cubs, exhausted from their ordeal, had fallen asleep in their makeshift den. John watched them, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison. "Your mama knew exactly what she was doing," he whispered. "She chose this old vet because she knew I'd understand." Mark arrived mid-afternoon, his official truck crunching on the gravel driveway. Despite his uniform and badge, Mark's approach to wildlife issues had always been practical and compassionate. He examined the cubs carefully while John explained the mother wolf's condition and remarkable behavior. "I've seen some amazing things in this job," Mark said, watching the cubs sleep. "But this is something special. That mother wolf showing such trust in a human? Incredible." The paperwork was straightforward, given John's qualifications. A temporary wildlife rehabilitation permit was issued, with the understanding that the cubs would eventually need to be transferred to a proper wildlife sanctuary when they were older. "But that's months away," Mark assured him. "They need round-the-clock care now, and there's no one better qualified than you, John. I'll help you connect with wolf specialists who can advise on their development." After Mark left, John sat in his old armchair, watching the cubs sleep. The events of the day felt almost surreal. He glanced at Claire's photograph on the wall, her smile seeming particularly knowing today. "Well, honey," he said to the photograph, "looks like I'm a father again at 68, to 3 wolf cubs, no less. You'd have loved this." The rest of the day fell into a routine of feeding, cleaning, and monitoring. John dug out his old veterinary notebooks on canine care, adapting his knowledge for these wild babies. He knew the coming weeks would be challenging. Wolf cubs required intensive care and eventually, careful socialization to prevent imprinting on humans. That evening, as the cubs suckled their bottles with increasing confidence, John heard a distant wolf howl. It wasn't their mother. He knew her time had likely already passed. But perhaps it was a member of her pack, mourning her absence. "Your wild family is out there," he told the cubs softly. and someday you'll return to them. But for now, this old vet will be your family. The following weeks transformed John's quiet cabin into a bustling nursery. He named the cubs, though he knew he shouldn't, based on their distinctive features. The bold one with the white chest patch became Scout, the largest gray female Luna, and the smallest, most curious one, Shadow. His daily routine now revolved entirely around their care. Every 3 hours, like clockwork, he prepared their formula, maintaining detailed records of their feeding schedules and weight gain. His veterinary experience proved invaluable, but raising wolf cubs presented unique challenges. "You three are keeping this old man busy," he chuckled one morning, watching them attempt their first wobbly steps around their enclosure. He'd converted his spare room into a wolf nursery, with plenty of space for them to explore safely. Sarah, his daughter, called during one of the feeding sessions, surprised by the background noises. "Dad, what's that squealing I hear?" John took a deep breath. "Well, honey, you might want to sit down for this." He explained the situation, half expecting her usual worried response about him taking on too much. Instead, she surprised him. "Oh, Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is exactly what you needed. When can I come visit?" "Give them a few more weeks," he replied, watching Scout attempt to crawl over Luna. "They need to get stronger first." As the cubs grew, John faced the delicate balance of providing care while preventing them from becoming too accustomed to humans. Mark visited regularly, bringing guidance from wolf specialists and helping John modify his approach. "Remember," Mark reminded him, "they need to stay wild. We're just temporary guardians." John created a schedule that minimized human contact while ensuring their needs were met. He began incorporating natural sounds and scents into their environment, playing recordings of wolf howls and bringing in pine branches and forest debris to maintain their connection to the wild. The cubs' personalities emerged more clearly each day. Scout, true to his name, was always the first to investigate new things. Luna, the largest, showed natural leadership qualities, often organizing their play sessions. Shadow, though smallest, proved to be the cleverer one, figuring out ways to escape their enclosure that kept John on his toes. One morning, about 6 weeks after their arrival, John witnessed a milestone that brought tears to his eyes. The cubs were playing in their secure outdoor enclosure, a necessity as they grew more active, when a distant wolf howl echoed through the trees. All 3 cubs stopped their play, ears perked, and instinctively responded with tiny howls of their own. "That's right, little ones," John whispered, recording the moment in his journal. "That's your real family calling." The challenges grew along with the cubs. Their milk teeth came in, followed by an intense period of teething that left John's furniture worse for wear. Their play became more vigorous, their appetites more substantial. He began introducing small pieces of meat into their diet, following the wildlife specialist's protocols. During this time, John found himself reflecting more on the mother wolf's sacrifice. He'd returned to the area where he'd last seen her several times, eventually finding evidence that confirmed his suspicions about her fate. He marked the spot with a small cairn of stones. "You chose well," he told the quiet forest. "They're growing strong, just as you hoped." Sarah visited when the cubs were 2 months old, bringing her camera to document their progress. She found her father transformed, more energetic and engaged than she'd seen him since her mother's passing. "Mom would have loved this," she said, watching him prepare their meals. "She always said you were happiest when helping animals." John nodded, thinking of Claire's nature photographs. She would have had her camera out every minute of the day with these 3. The cubs' development brought daily surprises. They learned to hunt insects in their enclosure, pounced on each other with increasing coordination, and began showing interest in the wilderness beyond their protected space. John knew their time with him was limited, but each day brought new joys and challenges. One evening, as he sat watching them play under the setting sun, he realized how much they'd changed his life. The silence that had once pressed in on him was replaced by their playful growls and yips. His days had purpose again, filled with the satisfaction of helping these wild creatures prepare for their eventual return to nature. "Your mother gave me a gift too," he told them as they settled down for the night. "She reminded me that life goes on, and that there's always more love to give." As summer approached, the cubs grew rapidly, their fuzzy puppy fur giving way to sleeker coats. At 3 months old, they were becoming more wolf-like every day, their play increasingly mimicking hunting behaviors. John knew the time was approaching to begin their transition toward a more natural life. Mark arrived one morning with 2 wolf specialists from the Montana Wildlife Center. Dr. Sarah Martinez and Dr. Tom Bradford had years of experience rehabilitating wolf cubs, and their expertise would be crucial for the next phase. "They're in remarkable condition, John," Dr. Martinez commented, observing the cubs from the viewing area they'd set up. "You've done an exceptional job maintaining their wild instincts." The specialists helped John implement a new protocol. The cubs' enclosure was expanded to include a larger outdoor area, complete with natural features like fallen logs, small pools, and various hiding spots. More importantly, they began reducing human contact dramatically. "The hardest part starts now," Dr. Bradford explained. "They need to learn to fear humans, not trust them." This meant John had to change his entire approach. No more sitting with them during feedings, no more direct interaction. Food was now delivered through clever mechanisms that prevented them from associating it with human presence. It broke his heart to distance himself, but he understood the necessity. "It's like sending your kids to college," Mark joked, seeing John struggle. "Except these kids need to survive in the wilderness." The cubs' natural instincts began to surface more strongly. Scout, always the adventurous one, led his siblings in mock hunts, taking down the mechanical prey dummies the specialists had provided. Luna developed a keen sense for tracking, often finding hidden food items before the others. Shadow, true to form, became adept at stealth, practicing stalking techniques on unsuspecting birds that landed near their enclosure. One evening, something remarkable happened. A wolf pack's howls echoed through the forest, closer than usual. The cubs, now 4 months old, responded with growing confidence. But this time, the wild wolves answered back. "That's the local pack," Dr. Martinez confirmed during her next visit. "They're likely related to the cub's mother." Wolves are highly social, and family bonds remain strong even across generations. The pack began appearing regularly in the surrounding forest, never too close, but their presence was unmistakable. They would howl in the evenings, and the cubs would answer, an ancient conversation playing out across the wilderness. John documented everything in his journal, his entries becoming more bittersweet as he watched the cubs grow more independent. Today, Scout caught his first live prey, a mouse that had wandered into the enclosure. His siblings watched and learned. Their mother would be proud. Sarah visited again, helping to document the cubs' progress with her photography. "They're so different now," she observed. "More wild." "That's the goal," John replied, watching through the observation blind as the cubs practiced their hunting skills. "They need to be ready." The specialists began discussing release plans. The local pack's presence was a positive sign. It increased the cubs' chances of successful integration into the wild, but the timing had to be perfect, and the cubs needed to be completely prepared. As autumn approached, the cubs were nearly 6 months old and growing into their roles as young wolves. Their play had become more serious, their awareness of their surroundings more acute. They no longer looked to humans for comfort or interaction. Instead, they grew wary and alert whenever people were near, exactly as they should. One crisp September morning, John watched from his cabin as a large gray wolf appeared at the forest's edge. It stood watching the enclosure for several minutes, its posture curious but cautious. Through his binoculars, John could see it was a female, likely related to the cub's mother. "They haven't forgotten about you," he whispered, thinking of the cub's brave mother. "Your family is still watching over them." The wild wolf visited several more times over the next few weeks, always keeping her distance but maintaining a presence. The cubs would grow excited at these visits, running along the fence line, their bodies' language showing recognition of their own kind. During this time, John began preparing himself emotionally for the inevitable farewell. He knew the cubs' release would leave another void in his life, but he also understood that this had always been the goal, to help these wild creatures return to where they belonged. "Your mother trusted me to prepare you for this," he told them one evening, watching from afar as they moved with increasing confidence and grace. "And I promise you'll be ready when the time comes." October arrived with its brilliant colors and cooling temperatures. The cubs, now 7 months old, had grown into strong young wolves. The time for their release was approaching, and the wildlife team began implementing the final phase of their preparation. Dr. Martinez coordinated with local wildlife officials to identify the perfect release site, an area within the territory of the pack that had been showing interest in the cubs, but far enough from human settlements to ensure safety. The location would give them the best chance of either being accepted by the pack or establishing their own territory. The next full moon, Dr. Bradford suggested. Wolves are most active then, and the pack's howling will help guide them. John threw himself into the preparations, channeling his emotions into ensuring everything was perfect. The cubs would need to be fitted with tracking collars, minimal ones that would eventually fall off, to monitor their initial progress in the wild. "Just like watching your kids through college," Sarah teased during a phone call, though her voice held understanding of her father's struggle. The cubs had grown magnificent. Scout, with his distinctive white chest patch, had developed into a strong young male, his confidence tempered by caution. Luna's natural leadership qualities had flourished. She often took point during their practice hunts. Shadow remained the thoughtful one, calculating and clever in his movements. A week before the planned release, John sat in his observation blind, recording their behaviors one last time. "They move like their mother now," he wrote in his journal. "Same graceful stride, same watchful intelligence in their eyes." The specialists had implemented a final series of tests to ensure the cubs were ready. They successfully hunted live prey in their enclosure, showed appropriate fear of humans, and demonstrated the social behaviors necessary for pack life. Most importantly, they maintained strong bonds with each other, which would be crucial for their initial survival. The night before the release, John couldn't sleep. He sat in his kitchen, Claire's photograph seeming to watch him with gentle understanding. "I did my best, honey," he whispered, "just like their mother asked of me." Release day dawned clear and cold. The team arrived early. Dr. Martinez, Dr. Bradford, Mark, and 2 other wildlife officials. Sarah had driven up from Bozeman to support her father and document the event for the Wildlife Center's records. The cubs were carefully tranquilized the last time humans would handle them. As John helped attach their tracking collars, he allowed himself one final touch of each wolf's fur, a silent goodbye. "Remember everything your mother taught you," he whispered as they worked, "and everything you learned here." The team transported the sleeping cubs to the release site, a beautiful meadow bordered by dense forest. Recent signs showed the local pack had passed through the area just days before. The location was perfect, offering both coverage and hunting opportunities. As the tranquilizers began wearing off, the team retreated to a safe distance. John stayed longer than the others, watching through his binoculars as the cubs gradually awakened in their natural habitat for the first time. Scout was the first to rise, shaking off the last effects of the sedative. His posture immediately changed, alert, wary, wild. Luna and Shadow followed, their movements becoming more confident as they took in their surroundings. The cubs stayed close together, exactly as they should, beginning to explore their new environment. They moved with purpose, their training and instincts guiding them as they investigated scent marks and terrain. As dusk approached, a chorus of howls echoed through the forest, the local pack announcing their presence. The cubs froze, ears forward, then responded with their own howls. The sound, strong and sure, brought tears to John's eyes. "Time to go, Dad," Sarah said gently, touching his arm. "Let them find their way now." John nodded, taking one last look through his binoculars. The cubs were moving toward the source of the howling, their forms becoming shadows in the gathering darkness. They never looked back exactly as it should be. That night, back at his cabin, John sat on his porch listening to the distant howls. He could no longer distinguish his cubs' voices from the others, and that, he realized, was the greatest success of all. Sarah stayed with him that first night, understanding his need for company. "You know, Dad," she said, "what you did here is pretty amazing." John smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace despite the sadness. "Their mother gave me a gift," he replied. "She trusted me when she needed help the most. Sometimes that's all any of us can do, trust and hope." Winter came and went, and spring brought new life to the forest. John maintained his daily routines, but his cabin felt different now, not empty, but full of memories. The tracking data showed promising news. All 3 cubs had survived their first winter, staying together initially before gradually integrating with the local pack. "They're thriving," Mark reported during his monthly visits, showing John the latest tracking information. "The pack accepted them, just as we'd hoped." John had transformed the cubs' former enclosure into a rehabilitation space for other wildlife, working with the local center to provide temporary care for injured animals. His expertise and facility became valuable resources for the wildlife community. Sarah visited more frequently now, helping with the rehabilitation work. "You found your second calling, Dad," she observed one day, watching him tend to an injured fox kit. One crisp morning in late spring, almost a year after the cubs' release, John was walking his usual trail when he noticed fresh wolf tracks. He smiled, knowing the local pack sometimes passed through his area, though he rarely saw them directly. Following his normal routine, he sat at his favorite observation point, binoculars ready. The morning was quiet except for birdsong and the rustling of new leaves. Then he saw them. 3 young wolves emerged from the tree line across the meadow. Even at a distance, he recognized them immediately. Scout's white chest patch was unmistakable, Luna's confident stride unchanged, and Shadow's cautious movements were exactly as he remembered. They weren't alone. With them were 2 older wolves, clearly pack members, and, to John's amazement, 3 young cubs. Luna had become a mother herself, continuing the legacy of her own mother's sacrifice. John sat perfectly still, watching through his binoculars as the wolves moved through the meadow. They were clearly on a teaching expedition, showing the cubs' hunting techniques. He observed with pride how his 3 showed the same patience and dedication their mother had shown them. The wolves were unaware of his presence, exactly as it should be. They moved with the confidence of animals in their own territory, completely wild and free. John noticed how Scout had taken on a protective role, while Luna led the teaching, and Shadow watched the group's flanks. As he observed their interaction with the cubs, John remembered the mother wolf's trust in him that spring morning a year ago. He saw that same dedicated patience now in Luna's interaction with her own cubs. The cycle of life continued, wisdom passed down through generations. The wolves spent about an hour in the meadow before moving on, disappearing into the forest as silently as they had appeared. John remained seated, his heart full. He pulled out his journal. He'd maintained his detailed notes out of habit, and began to write. "Saw them today, Scout, Luna, and Shadow. They've grown into everything their mother hoped they would be. Luna has cubs of her own now. The sacrifice of one mother has multiplied into new life, new hope. Claire would say there's poetry in that." That evening, Sarah called as if sensing something significant had happened. John shared the morning's experience with her, his voice rich with emotion. "You know, Dad," she said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about moving back to Montana. The Wildlife Center needs a full-time photographer, and after seeing your work this past year..." John smiled, understanding what wasn't being said. "Your mother would like that," he replied. "She always said this place had a way of calling people home." Later that night, as he sat on his porch, the wolves began to howl. He could pick out multiple voices, the deeper tones of the adults, the higher-pitched yips of cubs, and somewhere in between, the strong voices of his three. The sound wasn't sad anymore, as it had seemed that first spring. Instead, it was a celebration of life, of survival, of family in all its forms. John thought of the mother wolf, of Claire, of all the circles of love and loss that made up a life. He picked up his journal one last time that night. A year ago, a dying mother trusted me with her legacy. In saving her cubs, she also saved something in me, the part that needed to care, to nurture, to love again. Sarah's coming home, the wolves are thriving, and life continues its eternal cycle. Sometimes the greatest acts of love are in letting go, trusting that what we've nurtured will flourish in freedom. Tonight, under the same stars that watched over a mother's sacrifice, her children's children run wild and free, their howls echoing through the forest like prayers of thanksgiving.